when we did get here, we were going to talk about one of the topics was going to be point protection, so that might be something good to hear from you guys about. And then just through the considerations of the Gold Pan Fire, like, I don't know. Personally, it's still hazy to me on why, and what led to the different course of action for it. So.
Okay, I got that one.
I think it's yours.
I could tell.
Okay.
So we know the beginning of the fire was that
Yeah.
you said, okay, it's going to be headed by fire, but then there was a certain point where things changed.
Okay.
And talk in a
Loud voice.
louder
In your,
voice.
Okay.
in your IC voice or your,
My
your
IC.
ranger, yeah, your
My
ranger
ranger
voice,
voice.
Dave.
Shout, but yeah. Okay.
Okay.
And
Okay. Well, so we're at Magruder Ranger Station, which is approximately, I'd have to look, but it's 8 miles or so from the fire origin. The Gold Pan Fire was named for Gold Pan Lake, the nearest geographic feature. It was started by lightning, and for probably 4 or 5 days, I think, remained fairly small and appeared to be a very normal kind of fire for that time. And I made the decision to manage it as a wilderness fire, that is, try to allow it to play its natural role in the wilderness, as is our goal in wilderness fire, particularly in the Selway Bitter and the Frank Church, where we've been managing fire longer than any place else in the Forest Service. So we monitored it for the first few days, and then Stu and I took a flight probably about the time we were going to get a projection through using fire models, using the FS Pro Run, to see what the eventual fire size might be. But it really wasn't, to my mind, a difficult decision. I've made a lot of wilderness fire decisions. Last count before I retired was 260 to 280 or something like that, numbers of decisions. So it wasn't unknown territory. And especially since the area immediately to the west of us, between the biggest value at risk from this fire from the start was what would have happened if it either impacted the Magruder Corridor Road and the outfitter camp there, or would it impact Magruder Ranger Station, which is a historic site, which is why you'll see some shake roofs on these buildings instead of metal roofs, because it's historic, and so that leads to its own mitigation issues. So anyway, I knew when the fire started that between the fire and the Selway River, there was the Beaverjack fire of 2005. There were other fires further up the river, Langdon and
Langdon Gulch.
Gulch.
There was at least 5 fires between here and Gold Pan
Yeah.
at that time from 2000
yeah.
that we could that it looked like were scars that fire was going to burn through, but it wasn't something that traditionally fire behavior on the west side of the Selway, the fire would back down, run up again, and back down, and we figured it would make it here in a while, in a couple of weeks, but not as rapidly as it came.
So, in those kinds of situations, and Stu and I have done this a lot together, so we're pretty comfortable. We've flown a lot of fires, looked at them, and managed a lot of fires as natural ignitions in the wilderness. Feel really good about that. And it's very important for the line officer, that was my role as a decision maker, to have a fire management officer who understood the wilderness values, the reason why we're allowing fires to burn in the wilderness, and what the fire behavior is likely to be. And so we looked at it and had seen many fires over the years back down to the Selway and stall out when they hit the Selway. And at the time I made the go decision, I remember the ERC, the energy release component, was at a rather normal level. And then for the next 8 days in Missoula, we had record low humidity, and here too. So the
100-degree temperature.
100-degree temperatures,
Single digit.
single-digit humidity. So nobody was predicting that, not the FS Pro Run, not the Weather Service for that matter. But it's still in wilderness, and that's still a natural outcome. So the end result is it arrived at the Selway a lot quicker than we thought. And when it did arrive at the Selway, we had this international seminar that's here now, was right here camped out doing the seminar, and that one evening we drove up to the pass, and it was apparent that it was had a good burn day, so there was a lot of activity, and I decided I needed to go on to West Fork and do my district ranger job rather than being host of the seminar they came back here, the seminar came back here and decided they really didn't want to stay here that night because beyond this ridge there was a column that was bent over here and made a lot of people uncomfortable, especially people from countries where they don't have a lot of fire. So they left, and we immediately initiated a fire crew from West Fork came over, started doing some structure protection, point protection around Magruder, but realizing that the bulk of the fuel hazard had been done in 2005 by the Beaverjack fire.
This whole face behind us here, all the way from as far as you can see to the right, throughout this whole western face, all the way around, burned in 2005 with that Beaverjack fire. And it spent about a week and a half doing that burn. It was a really slow underburn, really nice, low intensity fire. Cleaned up a lot of fuels.
The kind of prescribed fire you would never be able to have except in a wilderness setting where you could live with that fire for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever it takes. And just, I have a lot of pictures of sitting right here looking at this hillside with puffs of smoke in various places. But you can see most of it still has the appearance mostly of a green forested hillside. The ponderosa pine, fuel's been killed, fuel's been removed from underneath it. So frankly, I really wasn't that concerned about Magruder coming from this way. I don't want to sound too cavalier about it, but we knew we had this big fire and it was going to moderate fire behavior. But it went around the end of the fire, went around the end of Beaverjack, and ran up the ridge behind us here. And that's when our fire crew from West Fork came over here, and I think Skylar Brown was in charge one night, and they went up and they brought the fire down to the ranger station using drip torches during the evening, so that it wouldn't come down in a big way, and did a very successful job, I think, of bringing the fire down and securing this historic site. And the whole Magruder site is historic and very, very important. And so having that secured, that part of point protection with some sprinkler setup, was pretty well done. It was pretty well wrapped up. And so once the fire crosses the Selway, it's a different game, because instead of burning downhill with the wind behind it, it then can burn uphill with the wind behind it. And there were still fires out there from Grass Lunch and Hell's Half and a number of, if you're like me, you've forgotten half the names.
The biggest thing different about this fire compared to the ones Dave just mentioned is those all started up high on the mountain, and this one it came across, spotted right down to the Selway River, and so it had the 3,000 vertical feet or whatever it is to the top of Hell's Half lookout above it to run in through.
And so at that point, it was apparent it was going to be a long-term, long-duration event. Could get quite large. We weren't certain how. You never know how big it'll be. But as it continued its way up, we started to say, well, the next value at risk is Hell's Half Acre Lookout, where we'll be. And so that lookout was wrapped in shelter material, like it's been wrapped probably 5 or 6 times at least since I've been here. At least, I don't know, probably more than that. And so that point was in protection, and the fire could make its way there as the just 2 years previous, or a year previous, the Saddle Fire, or the Mustang Complex made it all the way to the Salmon River and came up to Hell's Half, and had patchy burn pattern around Hell's Half, really very, very natural. And then so with that out of the way, then the idea is how big will this be, and what are the chances that it'll impact private land over the divide into Montana. And so it looked like it could eventually make its way all the way to the divide, go over into the Blue Joint, which hasn't had Blue Joint Wilderness Study Area, which is also managed as a wilderness, so fire is not an unwanted event there. But by that time it's a bigger fire by quite a bit. It turned out to be 42,000 acres over a period of weeks. So the decision was made initially to bring in a fire use management team, Diane Hutton's fire use management team, and a lot of them are familiar faces here on the West Fork, having been here before. And so they set it out with how to manage and make projections and protect the values at risk that were out in front of the fire. And so at that point, it was primarily trail bridges. It was keeping the fire from crossing the Magruder Corridor Road near Krim Creek Saddle, because that provided a pathway to the Selway that we were thinking might be one way that it was going to go. Instead, it made an end run to the south. So that team did a marvelous job. They set up the long-term plan, set out a lot of projections about how the fire would likely play out. And then I think because of the the size of the fire, the decision was made to bring in an incident management team, more of a suppression-oriented incident management team. And Carol, yes?
I mean, who made that? Who called for that?
Well, I think that was the 4 supervisors' prerogative to do that. You know, to be honest, I don't know that there was ever a point where we really discussed that too much. But I think that, and I've said it before, if I had it to do over again, I would not have called in a Type 1 incident management team for a couple of reasons. Number one, they cost a lot of money, regardless of what they do, and this was a wilderness fire, still a wanted event. We really didn't need to put it out. And unfortunately, our fire teams have either one or the other. Incident management teams they really want to do a lot of stuff. And in wilderness, that's a real threat. So over the years at West Fork, my goal when we have an incident management team that comes especially from a real suppression background, most of the time you're saying, you don't need to do that. And in this case, we had that same incident. You know, they're trained that way, but we nestled them in with the fire use management team with the hope that they would learn from one another, that the fire use management team would help to the incident management team to appreciate the need for long-term plans for
And they're
fire
both
behavior.
they're both incident management teams, and it's just that the wildland fire management team is more specialized in dealing with long duration fires and building a plan, and taking action on fires where necessary, and taking a waiting game, preparing for the fire to get to a certain point in time or place. And
Yeah.
the Type 1 team that came in, they're primarily called in for the biggest fires in the nation, the highest risk, highest potential, and so they're used to hard action, going tooth and nail, trying to minimize damage to private infrastructure and communities.
So it was a new game for them, a wilderness fire, and and the fact that wilderness values were important, probably more important than fires they'd been on previous, certainly, normally. And so from one to the other, we had to help them understand that, you know, we don't want to leave scars on the landscape from fire suppression. We want this fire to be managed as much as we can as a natural event, but protecting the values at risk. Should the fire come over in a big way across the divide into Montana with a pathway down to private land was probably the biggest concern. But that was, again, a long ways away. But here we are, you know, I predicted it wasn't going to get as big as it did, so maybe the credibility wasn't that great after all, although the FS Pro run done about a week after that did show it becoming quite large, and sometimes those projections tend to over-project at times, and so you have to use a little bit of judgment in interpreting those every time. But it did continue to march to the east, and eventually went past the Hell's Half Acre Lookout, where we'll be later. Eventually did make it up to the divide, and at that time we were concerned that if it crossed the Magruder Corridor into an area called Peak Creek, which was really well aligned, and when Stu was FMO here and I was before he moved off to Moose Creek, we always thought, you know, if we get a fire in Peak Creek at the wrong time because of its alignment, it's one we would be really concerned about. Not to say we wouldn't manage it as a wilderness fire, but it had no fire scars ahead of it, and a pathway to the divide, and no fire scars that headed on the other side going down to private land. So that was a real concern that it might go that way. And then, but instead the fire, you always learn something from a long duration event that you don't learn if you just put it out. You learn that you don't know half of what you think you know. So the fire actually turned out to burn up Slow Gulch instead of Peak Creek, a different direction, and popped over into the Blue Joint, and then acted very, very naturally and quite benign. Well, benign would be the term someone used to fire would say, and did a good job of breaking up the continuity of fuels there. And at nearly the same time, we had a start on Nez Perce Peak, which was very close to the divide, and looked like it had a lot of potential, and it didn't do much of anything. It sat there. And backing up a couple of weeks earlier, we had another start near Salmon Mountain, the Goat Fire, and it sat there and came and was a total of 12 acres at the time it was done. So each of these fires, same burning conditions, different fuel conditions, different locations. So all that is from the wilderness management perspective is fine, because the fire did in wilderness what it would do, and that's what we're trying to achieve, is an unmanaged, untrammeled, wild landscape. And certainly one of the ways that you can see that expressed on the landscape is wild, free-roaming fires. I like to think of this Selway is so wild, there are wolves and fires, and they roam freely, both of them. So it's pretty cool that way, and people understand that, I think.
I wonder if you could talk, you mentioned how you are managing the wilderness fire. If you could talk real succinctly about, and you happen to have the knowledge of the different geography and what a fire potentially could do, because you've mentioned, was it Peak Creek?
Peak Creek,
Mhm.
yeah.
You know, it could have a clear corridor all the
Yeah.
way. Just talk very specifically
Yeah.
about the...
Peak Creek's aligned. It's a southwest-northeast alignment, and it would come right up from the bottom of the drainage here in Deep Creek and go right up over the divide into Montana and then down into the Blue Joint drainage. And you just have to think of that as just the wind can go funnel right up from the southwest. That's our prevailing wind, and then pop over the top and continue down in the same direction. So anytime you see that alignment in canyons, as a fire manager, you really start thinking about where is this fire going to go and how much influence is that wind going to have on moving it to downwind direction.
So that it gets out of the wilderness, is that?
It would come out once it goes into Montana. It's in the wilderness study area, and you still have 10 miles from the back end until it hits population, or not population, but private ground, and it's different conditions than over here, but still big risk anytime you thought about a fire being in the Blue Joint.
It changes dramatically the proximity to the values of risk, primarily private land. And what we want to do in wilderness is to make sure that the public understands and is not so severely impacted by this that they lose confidence in the wilderness fire program. We've had many fires, and this is, I think, about the only one that started out that way. We had to call in an incident management team on over many fires since I've been here. And one of the advantages of being here long term is you have a pretty good understanding of the topography and the terrain. So with that becomes a little more comfort and a little more confidence in what's likely to happen. But Gold Pan, I think if you look at the fire history, is interesting. It found the way out of the wilderness the only way that it could, by tracing a path where we had not had a lot of fire over the last 42 years of wilderness fire management in the Selway Bitterroot, and a little less in the Frank Church. But where there was existing fires, it was slowed down, and it found its way through there, and over the course of some time. And interestingly enough, one of the people we wanted to have on the field trip that wasn't there was Charles Scripps, who's the fire chief at Painted Rocks Fire District and lies over the hill. And Charles, when it got into the Blue Joint, he was not disappointed at all. He said it would be good if it would burn some more of the Blue Joint, because he sees that as fuel reduction between the wilderness and his fire district. And he says it's a good thing. He was not, I wouldn't say Charles was looking at it from the wilderness quality aspect as much as he's looking at it from a Painted Rocks Fire District perspective. But we've talked to him enough over the years. He understands that, as I think Steve Pine said, a fire put out is a fire put off. And he understands that. Said, if it burns a little now, breaks up the continuity of fuels, there's less of a chance of a bad event later.
So Stu, when you were on the flyover, did you have any perspectives that were different than what Dave talked about?
Our perspectives were pretty matched up at that point. We were both looking at a fire on the west side of the Selway, many miles and a couple thousand vertical feet above it. And having watched fires in here enough years, what my memory or what my experience said was it'll back down here unless we get a big wind blow. And then it has the chance of blowing across the river like the Sweat fire did in '96. The only other times we've had fires come across the river in Dave's and my experience was one time when we put fire on the west side of the river, and then it popped itself across. I was trying to stop it from coming across the river, and then the Brushy fire in 2007 popped across right down at Magruder Crossing and just burned right along between the river and the road. So nothing terrible. The weather we had right after Dave and I flew was not expected. I mean, neither one of us was thinking of 100-degree temperatures, single-digit RH, and no wind. As you can feel right now, we don't have the flag up. There's always this up canyon breeze here in the Selway, and my thoughts is that it's partially the reason that the fires stay on that side is any embers that are trying to go across are kind of turned and go back into the west side. And that day when it came across, it was dead calm out here. There was no wind, so it just was able to lob across and then land down at the bottom.
Yeah.
So you're always learning from fires.
Always learning, and every time you think you have it, you get thrown something else new. And one thing that I've been in the regional office for a few years, and I hadn't been on the ground actively watching like the Saddle Complex in 2012, and then Mustang as it grew, and to watch some of the fire behavior. So that type of thought process wasn't in my mind as much as it might have been Dave's or some other people that have been on the ground here for those years.
And you mentioned earlier about working with Stu when he was on the district before he moved to Moose Creek, that something about wanting to have a fire management staff or your fire management officer who had a wilderness sort of ethic or perspective. And is that rare? And can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't know how rare it is, but I mean, it's a district ranger's responsibility to make sure that the values of any fire are represented where it is, and the fire management officer's job is to manage fire, and you have a wilderness person on staff who's responsible also to make sure that wilderness character, wilderness values are represented. And in having been on the West Fork for 16 years, I was pretty much in sync with both of those thinking. So Deb Gale was our wilderness, still is the wilderness manager here. Stu was the fire management officer. We'd all been around enough fires, so it was not like it was a very rare. In fact, I can't even think of an instance where one of us said, we've got to do this on the fire, and somebody else said, no, we can't do that on this fire. There's a reason why. But I think it's critical not to overstate it too much, but somebody has to be the decision maker and take responsibility.
As the fire management officer, my job was to make a recommendation to Dave, and like if we had a fire right next to Hell's-Half Lookout, we had a number of fires that were right in the vicinity of the lookout, and I'd say, Dave, we should put this one out, and Dave would say, go ahead. And then we'd have other ones that were at some risk to Magruder or Paradise or one of our outfitter camps, and I would make a recommendation to it, and Dave would say, well, I think we're going to let this, we'll manage this one. And I'd go, okay, that's his decision as the line officer, and my responsibility as the fire management officer is now to manage that ignition, that fire.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why always during the summer months we'd have acting ranger rotations on the district. I would never have a fire management officer take an acting ranger rotation during the summer, because you really need them to do the fire management job. And if you're trying to wear both hats at the same time, you'll do neither job very well, I think. And so it really, and after a time, and you develop that working relationship with people, you understand each other really very well. And I can't say enough about the people that I had working for me there that I could really count on. And I mean, if Stu were to tell me, this is a really crazy idea, I would listen to that pretty carefully, because he's not liable to throw that out just because he doesn't want to manage the fire for 4 months. That I knew he wasn't going to do that. So
I would always make, if there was major concerns, we'd always discuss them and make it well versed and knowledgeable, and then we'd go forth with the decision that was made. Dave always liked to make the comment that, give me enough rope to hang myself. Make a bad decision.
Yeah, but if this was not a career-ending decision, because I'd already decided to retire.
I have a question. You both have talked about the comfort that you had in making these decisions through your experience of working with the fires here, and now Dave, you've retired, and Stu, you've gone to another position. So there are new staff, or relatively new staff, who are going to be faced with some of the same kinds of decisions, and I'm wondering how long will it take for them to develop that comfort, or what do you see as continuing this legacy and having this area be a good place to experiment with fire and this fire?
it's not an experiment with fire, it's a management of fire.
Yeah, it's no longer an experiment. I
No.
think the experiment has been proven to be very successful.
And we manage fire. We now have two types of fire. We have wildfire and we have prescribed fire. And all fires, inside wilderness, outside of wilderness, you can manage them for resource objectives, resiliency. So it's like Dave said, it's the experiment has been proven, and we're trying to pass that on outside. There's a lot of risk when you do that closer to populated areas. I mean, this is the Selway Bitterroot and the Frank Church. We're very fortunate. It's a big backyard, and it's a long ways to values.
And because we've been managing fire this way for 40 years in the Selway, slightly less in the Frank, it's pretty much as Steve Pine called it, a self-regulating system. And like I said, Goldpan found the only way out. But to get to your question about how do you get to that comfort level, you know, and I would say everybody's got to have a first experience. You know, you can't, you know, the first time you do anything, ride a horse, kayak down a rapid, whatever you're going to do, there's going to be a certain amount of uncertainty that goes away with time. And so anytime you have a new line officer or a new fire management officer, they're going to look at it differently and probably with a little more aversion to taking a risk, which is what most people feel about allowing a fire to burn. Because one of the problems we have is no apparent incentive for going ahead and managing fires as long-term events, but a lot of incentive for putting it out. I mean, if you put it out, then people say, well, we're done with that, thanks, we don't have to worry about it. If you do in this case, I had a discussion with my fire management officer. He said, you know, if you decide to let this burn, we're going to be dealing with this for the whole summer. My response was, that's your job. That's what we get paid for.
Some places, fire management officer, their job is heavy suppression. In other places, the West Fork District, Moose Creek District, a lot of your fires in the wilderness, and it's learning how to manage the fire, developing the skills to be prepared. I always like to tell firefighters that we're professionals at firefighting. We shouldn't be reacting to these as emergency events. This is our job, and we should be having a plan. Whether or not the plan goes off according to the playbook is one thing, but having the plan built so it's not a reaction but a implementation of actions.
Yeah, and as the program has matured now, I think as long as we maintain suppression and natural fire, we have fire management. If we just go to, if we were to just be in a suppression mode, we wouldn't be able to really call ourselves much fire managers, because we'd just be fire control officers. So it's really a much more well-rounded, the policy's there, but it does take some time for people unfamiliar with situations to be, and that's human nature. I would not criticize somebody coming in and making a different decision after I left, when I'd made well over 200 decisions and got comfortable, and somebody else has to come in and make their first decision. It'd be ridiculous to expect them to be in any way comfortable making that call.
They need to have their time to be able to build their experience, their comfort level, and develop themselves as a team.
Yeah.
Dave and I worked together for a number of years, and we knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, and we could pretty well work with that quite well.
Yeah, I think somebody else might have been put off or might have been surprised that we would come to a decision in about 2 minutes for some fires.
I'd quite often call Dave 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night and say, Dave, we've got a new fire out in Stripe Mountain. Okay, good, thanks.
Because we both knew what Stripe Mountain looked like, we both knew what the fire history was. We didn't have to go through a listing of all the attributes.
Yeah.
That's a luxury, and it's a benefit of being able to stay in one place for a while.
So I'm very curious. I mean, okay, the two of you have developed a history, developed a narrative. Is it passed on to the next teams?
Well, yeah, I think it is. You know, I think that the current ranger at West Fork, Ryan, took part in the large fire conference field trip, although we weren't fortunate enough to get here because it passed on the snow on the pass. But even with that narrative, even knowing all that, it really doesn't. I mean, you have to ink that line. I'll give you a quote from, and I don't think she'd mind, from former regional forester Gail Kimball, who came out during 2005, and we flew over fires. We were managing 50 fires at the time, and Gail told me she'd never been on a unit that managed natural fires before, and she came back and she said this was just an incredible experience for her to see just how you manage that many fires at one time. And I'm sure Stu remembers this too, because we landed at the Lone Pine Hill Base, drove back to the West Fork office, came in the back door, and Stu said, "Hey Dave, we have another fire." And I said, "Well, Gail, do you want to sign this one, the go decision?" And she said, "No, go ahead." But I mean, it was partly a joke, but I mean, it's true that it was a lot easier to make those calls once you've been around a long time, but having said that, Gail, having come out and see firsthand, she gained a lot of comfort. So there was never any question from her about what we were doing here. She said, "That's fine and dandy. We appreciate what you're doing."
For a new ranger to come in on any district like this, they don't have the knowledge of the drainages, the lay of the land, the history of the land. Dave could fly up, and you could probably blindfold him, take the blindfold off, and ask him where he was after flying around for a few minutes, and he'd be able to tell you within pretty short order.
Within 100 square miles or something.
Yeah, he was going to tell you in the Selway Bitterroot or the Frank, he could find that one out. But he would be able to pick out the scars. And it's going to take a new ranger, a new fire management officer, a bit of time before they have that comfort level in their gut, knowing where they are, and then just knowing how things tend to move and where they want to go.
So are there any fires on the district right now that are being managed for benefits?
I don't believe there are.
There are not any fires being managed for benefits. There are wildfires and the prescribed fires.
With an objective other than
No, I don't think so. No.
No, and I think, but again, that one of the ways that risk gets mitigated, and one of the ways that you get comfortable, is you get closer to the end of the season. And of course, with climate change, you wonder when is that end of the season event. So I think that as the season wears on, that not just in the Selway Bitterroot, but other places, people will feel more comfortable with the idea. Okay, this event, if I'd approved it in July and it went to October, that's all that much. But if I approve it in August and it goes to October, the chances for it to get big are that. So you get more and more comfortable as it gets towards the end of the year. The difficulty becomes early in the year when that has the opportunity to occupy you and become very big and draw a lot of questions. In the early days of the program, we used to say, one of the fellows that used to be in the job Stu has now, Rich Lasko, said, well, you have to think about, at that time, the risk to the program. In other words, we didn't want to go out there and be reckless and create this enormous fire that then people would say, well, we always knew that program was kind of crazy, and this is proof of it. So we didn't want to provide that kind of evidence.
In the early days of the program, we also had a limited pot of money to work with.
Yeah.
It wasn't the general suppression dollars that we work with now. And so you had $100,000 to manage fire in wilderness for the whole season. And after that, you're kind of begging and borrowing to figure out how you're going to manage.
Yeah, we've come a long way. I think policy-wise, and we've come a long way in our understanding of the value of wilderness fire for many reasons. For the wilderness characteristic of it, for the value to research. You learn from every fire a little bit of what you didn't know before, and that was with using the fire use management team, Diane's team, with the Type 1 team, Ponson's team. They did have a lot of discussions about what they needed, and I think one of the things that came out of that is the Type 1 team said, well, maybe we need to go with a strategic operational planning position, or somebody that does the long-term planning that they don't do because they're not thinking of long-term. They're thinking, we're going to put this thing out and go on to the next one, instead of how do we manage a long-duration event. And how do you manage a long-duration event with a changeover of teams? With transition is always a watch-out situation. So some of the time we've had where we had the same team and would rotate off portions of the team, so they all got a chance for a day off, but there was some continuity of understanding what was going on. In fact, the Fire Echo, where we went across in 2000, was precisely during one of those changeovers of one operations section chief wanted to be more aggressive than the guy who was off. And by aggressive, you mean just wanted to apply a little fire. And so we didn't have that continuity, and we ended up with a fire crossing. Not a huge problem, but it did show that, you know, every time you change a personnel, you have a chance for a miscommunication and
You
change.
have to relearn what the story is and what the plan are.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Have we sufficiently incriminated ourselves? We can go
yeah,
look out.
you definitely.
I should
you're
retire now,
on the
Dave?
10 most wanted.
We're still
I was already-
rolling.
We're still rolling.
I was already there.
I want to get some shots. Okay, so that hillside over there,
Was in the Beaverjack fire
Beaver Jack. Okay. this is-
in 2005.
Okay, blood.
What's that?
Good blood.
We should probably be headed to the lookout pretty
Okay,
soon
so
too.
that's the Beaver Jack.
Yeah, Beaverjack fire. So on that distant hillside, the Beaverjack fire burned, and on this side of the Deep Creek Road of the Magruder corridor, the Goldpan fire was burned between here and there, and then all this hillside behind us here, behind the buildings, was part of the Beaverjack fire. As it marched up along this hillside, and quite a ways up there, so it primarily burned the deadened down material and torched a few trees here and there, so that when the Goldpan fire came last year, that was essentially hazardous fuel reduction that had taken place through a wilderness fire of this facility at Magruder. And then in the distance, I don't know if you is the horse jump.
Get a tighter shot of this.
So it's 2:10 now. She said they are still talking over there, but she wants a official meeting minutes by 2:30.
In the replay, what?
2:30,
Oh,
so
yeah,
we're
we
at
should,
2:20.
yeah.
And then I don't know, should we try to talk about the outfitter guard stuff too, or should we save that for when we get back?
No, I say it didn't get that.
Okay. All right. So yeah, if you guys
Yeah,
just
we
want
should
to
probably
wrap up.
Okay, so now this is
This is this near mountainside is from it was burned during the Beaverjack fire of 2005. That was the year we had like 50 fires going. This was one of them, probably one of the more significant ones. And then in the background is Horsejaw Mountain, and that's where the Goldpan fire crossed the Selway about, it must be about a mile upstream, and made it around up Horsejaw Mountain, moved downstream and came up this pasture ridge right here. So when we were here with this group last year, there was fire on that ridge top.
okay. So if that all the way over here is
Yeah.
Goldpan.
Yeah, you guys, there's not a lot of real red trees on the
Right.
Beaverjack, but if you
Right.
look on the Horsejaw Mountain over here, the light's kind of difficult for filming, I suppose.
Not if I get in close. Not if I get in close.
Okay.
Let's see.
And you can see there's pockets of high intensity and pockets of unburned as well.
At some point, just let them know that the filming is related to a video about wilderness fire.
Yeah.
Kind of an educational video about it. And so then, we always want to say if anyone's uncomfortable being on film, they should either let us know or just stay behind the camera.
Or maybe one in the middle of the country. Okay. I'll go tell them that now and wrap that up.
Anybody wanted?
Yeah. I told them when they're talking to the Superior Backus, the reporter who's here, I said, don't worry, we won't send any of this back home.
Yeah. If there is,
Russia, you know.
if there is somebody that doesn't want to be just.
Oh, well.
Okay, let me get this. There's. The lighting's. It's pretty hazy, but I'm just getting 10, 15 seconds of it. Different. Let's see if we can get the timers. Yeah, well, that's what we're talking about. Yeah. Fire and smoke. Smoke goes with fire. Yeah, I mean, that's. Let's see what happens.